What's up, you guys? Welcome to PAWCast number 70. In this episode, Dr. Riolo and I sit down. We started off, we really had no idea where it was going to go, but ended up in a great place, really talking about some of the biggest barriers that we experience to collaboration and how we can sort of eliminate those to maximize the opportunities that we have to work together as a team to ultimately serve the patient more effectively. So I really hope you guys enjoy. Let's get to the show.
There we go. All right. Usually when that gets that fade, I'm like, here we go. It's like, not yet. So, okay. All right. So we're back.
Yeah, you're back.
I'm back.
I've been here the whole time.
That's right. That's true. And yes, I am
so
available.
You have as well.
Yes.
For that matter, just in the other area of the building.
But on the floor, yes. Yeah, but it's been, I think we say it every year. It's a busy summer, and has been. But I think for me, administratively, I think what has been busy is really trying to figure out, I don't want to say operations, but I think it's just a matter of efficiency and growth. I think, I shouldn't even say I think. That's what we talked about for whatever number podcast this is. It's always some degree of growth. How do we grow? How do we grow? How do we grow? How do we grow? But a lot of what we talk about is almost like individual. And I think what we don't give enough merit to is sort of that collaborative component. Like, how do you do it in a group? Like, how does a group grow? And, now that the new website is live, the education portal is live. So for those of you, of course, listeners, first-time listeners or long-time listeners, if you go to pawhealth.net, we have our new education portal for veterinary professionals. So it's going to be students, certified technicians, veterinary nurses, veterinarians. So, the whole point is that, on there, we're going to start to put, obviously, our PAWCast content is going to be on there, at least in some capacity, but it really is that heavy collaborative side, how do we do any of it, from after actions to, 515s to, strategic planning, but then also like from inventory management. So it really is a platform of collaboration, and how we kind of do the things that we do. But more importantly, it being sort of free to the industry is, again, that ongoing collaborative part. If we have viewers that watch this or watch this, hey, I think there's a better way to do this, or we've had experience with that. I think it, is bi-directional, at least in that capacity. But again, I think, for what we have, and that was kind of our coming into 2021, core value changed. We went from trust, respect, unity, and accountability. Unity, we flipped out to collaboration, primarily because trust, respect, those all in some capacity need unity. Accountability needs unity. But, really what I think we do relatively well on, how can I say, it's like on the leadership level. I think we're, very, very efficient at collaboration. Break down into our supporting role members, not quite as much. And then, certainly then getting up into our, supported staff. I don't know that really any collaboration happens, and I think it does, like on the, individual transaction level, from here's phlebotomy, here's how we run the blood machines, so I think there is like definitely a training component to collaboration, but that's very mechanical. It's like, here's how you do a catheter, here's how you wrap this, here's how you do the treatments, this is what you dilute this to, this is where we have inventory. So it's really more of a, collaboration in some capacity can be a fulfillment of task or fulfillment of process, but really collaboration comes down to that same idea of growth, because we say that there's two jobs in PAW Health. You have your, your role description, and then you have more of like a cultural description. How do we function within the team, and, how do we deal with conflict, and so on and so forth. So really, that's why I said, for me, administratively coming into this summer, it's been a lot of like 30,000 foot view type things, like really big picture things. Like, all right, if we're bringing collaboration in as one of our new core values, what does that actually mean? Like, what does that actually mean? And why is that now a core value and unity isn't? Well, of course, I said a few minutes ago that you have to have unity for all of it to work. But it really gives merit to the point that, this collaboration that we have had and this collaborative tools that we have had over the last 5 years work really, 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 really well, from a strategic planning standpoint and from a leadership standpoint. But we really haven't followed through onto the supported staff level. And I think what we, I was just talking to a new staff that just came on board today or this week or whatever, is it's like, we have these tools of growth. We have these tools of education, but, the game that we were playing at 20 employees to now being 60 plus is there are definitely shades of similarity, jobs were a little bit different, but, there are things that we kind of just sort of let fly under the radar, because at 20 employees, like, are you going to tackle this really huge problem that may be affecting one person? It's like, well, yeah, definitely. If it's significantly impacting that one person, you definitely want to address it. But it gets back to our same question. Is this an individual problem or is this a systems problem? Right. Well, part of identifying systems problems is that sometimes you have to have a lot of people failing the same or falling the same way or making the same mistakes before you can identify that it's a systems problem. But when you have 15 to 20 employees, there might not be the influx of conflict.
Right.
Or I shouldn't say influx, what I should say is the identification of the volume. Yes, the volume of conflict. Because if you have 20 employees, it's a lot of, well, I got your back. And that's kind of your team. You want, I got your back, I got your back, I got your back. But it's kind of, we talked about in past podcasts with this family dynamic, is if we have a smaller group, a family group, it's like, well, so-and-so is not good at this. I got your back. I'm going to pick up the slack for you. Yep. And it's like, all right, well, the idea is, yes, if they need help, please help them. But it's not an indefinite help. That's kind of the difference between a rescuer and a mentor. As a rescuer is just more of like quick to save the day, where a mentor is more of like, all right, encouragement. Okay, I'm going to show you how to do this. Sort of, providing that support, but it's not indefinite support. So when you have conflict in smaller groups, sometimes it is difficult to identify is it systemic? Is it individual? But as you start to grow your staff, you start to grow as an organization, I feel like the I got your back doesn't necessarily go away. It's just you get a little bit better about what defined roles are, what defined jobs are, what defined responsibilities are. And then you start to have the statistical outliers. It starts to become more obvious when they're not sort of fulfilling their role, or we have conflict that is being generated among multiple people that then indicates that there's a systemic problem.
Right.
So for us, and that's what I've been thinking about a lot this summer, because remember, we're all talking about collaboration and why collaboration is now a core value, is saying, all right, well, what we did at 20 versus now 60 plus, the stuff that we kind of let the team sort of figure out, or we were there on the floor managing 20 people versus now we're on the floor trying to manage 60, or administratively, from the sidelines or whatever, trying to manage that many people. It is more difficult when we don't have tools of growth to be utilized at the ground level. And if you have tools of growth, who is keeping an eye on whether or not those tools are being used to grow? And that's where I've been really kind of struggling here through this summer. And I've talked to Annie and Katie and of course yourself, is really talking about how do we track this? How do we identify? Because what we don't want to have is an environment where, we basically sell snake oil. Because if we look at our education system, the education system, there's 4 different tiers to it. And those 4 tiers are mimicked between students and between veterinary professional, or at least, postgraduates, I should say. Is saying, all right, well, we have, tier 1, 2, 3, 4, and here's the plan. And what we have, at least in tier 3, is the idea with tier 3 for employees is this every 6-month touch point with Annie as senior accountability. And we don't do peer reviews. I think we've talked about that before. We do performance reviews. It's a performance-based system. But then it's a matter of like, all right, I go through a performance review. We've kind of even flipped that on its head, where now it's actually individual run, it's employee run performance reviews. And it's more of how and what are we failing at, where do we have growth, what would we like to work on. And then that's where, I don't want to say it stops, but it kind of stops.
Yeah.
That was actually one of the big things that I was looking at coming into this year. Is it's like we have all these different tools, we have all these different things, and at the leadership level, I mean, we know, we're like, oh yeah, well obviously this is what we use and this is how we get stuff done and da 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 da. But it's more of like, all right, if we had 20 employees, 20 or less, and we're doing performance reviews twice a year, that was a lot for 20 people.
Yeah.
When we were a smaller group, it was like, why are we doing this so often? Or it was like, we have employees. Well, I just did this 6 months ago. Like, why do I have to do this again? We just had it. It was almost like it was too much.
Yeah.
But then, our education system didn't grow, because we talk about scalability. It didn't, I don't want to say it didn't grow, but it didn't really define the quote unquote job or the responsibilities or, where sort of the buck stopped when it came to what happens between those 6 month intervals. Who's tracking, who's doing what. And at least in some way, shape, or form, we had, 4 core group. We had a couple other things, but where we ended was, this was a couple of years, maybe a year ago, something like that, a year and a half. We came up with what we call our supporting role members. So supporting role members would basically be like the equivalent of a, head tech or head doctor, head support staff, but really more again because we're an inverted org chart. It's actually these people are supporting the other supported staff. So the idea was that, with the supporting role members, it was going to be a matter of like, okay, well, as we have, Annie in charge of accountability, they were supposed to sort of work more, with the staff, train them where they needed to be trained, get some information back to Annie if they were struggling. And then the last 18 months happened.
Right.
COVID happened.
Yeah.
We went from however many cases to now. I mean, this year, I swear to God, if we don't hit 19K, I think it's going to be insane on patient load. So our patient load has gone up, and I mean, we have all these excuses, right? So, at least in some way, shape, or form, being unaccountable to the task. It's like, I don't want to be victim to the amount of business that we have or the amount of patients that we have. It's not a matter of saying, well, COVID is my excuse for having poor administration. COVID is my excuse for the SRMs not following up with staff. COVID is my excuse for this and that. It's not really what it is. It's an objective identification of being like, all right, we had a substantial stressor on our, ground floor process. We had a substantial stressor on our administrative process. We have well over half of the people in survival mode, and it's, well, how are we dealing with that in our current roles? Because obviously our supporting role members still have their full-time jobs, so then I got, 501c3, I got lead tech, I got, medical support coordinator, then they have this other add-on role, and it's like, damn, they're barely keeping their head above water on that just for as busy as we are staying late, and, so on and so forth. So now again, objectively that has happened. So now it's a matter of saying, how do we take the tools that we have and how do we bring it then to the level of the supported staff in a responsible way? And, again, of course, you and I kind of brainstorm on it. Katie brainstormed, Annie, so on and so forth. So we have a couple ideas out there, on exactly how to do it. And see, again, for me, I don't want to jump the gun here because Katie still has, her input and stuff that she's going to have in on it, and then we'll, kind of figure out the actual process. But the idea is, while we have a senior accountability officer, someone to sort of hold employees accountable when there's been a clear, break of process or interpersonnel conflict or inefficiency or, whatever it is. But really what it is that there needs to be an active process of collaboration. And, for me, the idea is, what tools do we have for collaboration? And I think about the utility of the after action, and our after action report it's pretty legit, because it's like, we took the one from the armed forces and said, all right, this is how they run it. And I mean, we talked about this too, like, I say we definitely use the first half according to the Armed Force Institution, but the last half we kind of don't.
Yeah, I mean, it gets used in the way that it's supposed to, but there's all of the work. And I've never been in one as a Marine, right? So I don't know specifically how they use it, but there's almost all of the work is done in the establishment of reality. Like, it's
correct.
That is like the way when you hear somebody say to hold someone else accountable, that's basically what they're referring to, is establishing reality within a group. Now, we generally do it poorly outside of professional or just like a shared outcome circumstance, right?
Oh yeah.
But that's like when you say like we need to hold these people accountable. It's like, well, just acknowledge what reality is. Yeah. Like that's typically what they're referring to, and there's a lot of work that goes into it to do it the right way.
Yeah.
And then once you get through that process, it just feels like those like the second question or the third and fourth and fifth questions of what's the plan and who's going to do it is just so natural. Yeah. It's just like, well, clearly because of what the problem is, this is now the solution. We've now share what this definition is. This part's now easy versus we're not going to talk about what the problem is. Yeah. We're just going to try and Band-Aid it, and then we put all the work on the back end, and maybe we'll get lucky 20% of the time.
Right. Well, no, and I mean, for a hip shot statistic, I don't think that's far off. No. Because, I mean, the times that we've run after actions, we had a plan going in. Yeah. This is obviously what it's going to be, and this is going to be the outcome. And then it's like, yeah. You know, the one that our famed one, you know, that was 3.5 hours. There was 37. Is that what it was? Yeah. 37 different points of education or learning or growth, half of which I don't even think we saw.
No.
You know, maybe.
No, we would have noticed an absence of a solution being implemented.
Sure.
Because the problem would have resurfaced. Yeah. But it was one of those things where it's like, okay, all of these people have their 2 or 3 things that they're going to do, and there's 12 people in the room. Right. So everyone just go do your thing, and it didn't really repeat. Yeah. Or the problem was the person, and the person didn't repeat.
Right. Yes. Yes.
But I think what you're getting at is has been historically our most active collaborative process.
Yes.
It's the most engaging in terms of like volume, but also in terms of just people, because case reviews are technically a collaborative process as well, but you have less people, similar type of work, all that sort of stuff. But that's the thing where we've seen the most headway made in the shortest amount of time.
Absolutely. No, yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, it's, you know, for what it's worth. I mean, because so actually we just called, I just called an after action, but it was more so of just everyone was like, OMG, WTF, on an after action here on a case that, you know, has been here for about 6-7 days now. And actually medically, no problem.
Right.
Patient was treated appropriately right away. Patient's doing fine for all intents and purposes. Once we actually finally were able to get a hold of the people, actually pretty happy all the way around. But it was the clerical risk from the moment of intake now through discharge, all the different clerical mistakes that, you know, I would argue most of the staff that would have been in this event would have been exposed to as a matter of process, but never educated as a matter of importance.
Yep.
This is an acting agent. This is an owning caregiver. Okay, well, fine. Why do we have that? Well, I didn't get as much information as I should have on this. Well, yeah, whatever. And this person, it's like, no. These things have really significant legal ramifications, especially because Molly, in one of the multi-doctor, multi-tech state board complaints that we got, it was like 5 different licenses, and it essentially boiled down to who had identified themselves as the owner, who identified themselves as the acting agent. And the only reason why that case was an easy walkthrough, you know, just, you know, it was like, yep, wrote it together, sent it back, whatever, is because we had proper documentation along the way, who was who said what, I'm this, I'm the owner, that, nope, that's the acting agent, I made this decision. And then in the end, it was like, you know, the person who had identified, it was a boyfriend, had identified as the owning caregiver, then said to Molly, well, actually, it's my girlfriend's cat. And then Molly wrote that conversation in the medical record, which was single-handedly the strongest evidence that, you know, at this point, we hadn't done anything without consent. Right. You know, because had that not been there, then it would have been it wouldn't have been 100% loss, but it would have been more difficult. You know, so, but again, that was with, you know, we were 40-ish employees at that point, you know, so now that we're 60 plus, it's like, all right, just like I said, it's they have had exposure to this clerical process, but no one's really understood it. Yeah, that's the kind of going back to some of the other stuff that we talked about. That to me is that connection between role, responsibility, shared purpose, and then my personal ROI. And that can be a negative, right? So if it's going to if it's going to detract from my ROI, like I should probably know why this matters, essentially. And the more, actually I was kind of struggling with that yesterday in just doing some like tier 1 level training stuff, because
I kept contextualizing everything.
Yeah.
Like, it's so hard for me to not
Yes.
tell you why this matters.
Yeah.
But from a tier 1 perspective, it's like, you'll get it. It will get there.
Yes.
Especially if you do the process right from the get-go. Like, just trust the fact that this exists for a reason for a short period of time, and then ask why after you know what it is.
Yes.
Like, just do it.
Yeah.
Like, I promise you, and question it. Like, I'm not saying don't question the process.
Yeah.
But if I give you the full context why, there's so much stuff to absorb in your first 4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah.
You don't need that context immediately.
Yeah. Sometimes
you just got to do it and do it well, and then ask why later.
Well, that's what we did with the caregiver support guide.
Yeah.
You know, when we were working on that 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever it was, or 2.5 years ago, it was just like, all right, let's detail this out. We're going to have this algorithm. It's going to be a tornado warning. Okay, they just keep extending it. You know, I mean, that's what it was. It was like, well, hey, if we have this resource, and the resource has everything, and it's got the context, and this is why, and it was just like, that was a
lot of volume.
Behemoth. Yes. And so Joe actually, she's our processing specialist. She struggles with that. You know, when it's just like tier 1 training stuff, she's like, I have to constantly remind myself, or, you know, we talk about, you have to remind yourself, like, don't do all the what ifs, like just do the basic clicks, you know? And now, of course, that we're doing the video series and video walkthroughs for the education portal. That's the thing. And it's like, you have to just
that's the hardest part about doing those videos.
Sure.
Because I think all of us like just fundamentally struggle with it, because if you've been here more than 6 months, you know so many of those if-then scenarios.
Yeah.
But it's like, what are the foundational blocks that I've then built in my own head about each of these scenarios? Because it's like talking on the damn phone.
Yes.
There's an infinite number of if-thens.
Yes.
I cannot teach you all of them.
No.
But I can teach you the 7 things that you have to give to someone, and the 5 things you have to get from them.
Yes.
And then you have to fill in the gaps.
Yes.
Like that's the way,
shortest amount of time.
Right. If it goes more than 2.5 minutes, you're wasting time on the phone.
Yes, exactly. It is. Absolutely.
Dude, that is true math right there.
Yes, that is. Yeah, because you take 10 of those calls, that's a half hour of work. You know, I mean, it's what it is.
But I kind of, so I think I know, because we walked into this as we do with every other podcast, with not knowing a damn bit about what we're going to talk about. But I think I think you figured it out. And I was writing stuff down as you were kind of working through your thought process, as the goal is to have as much collaboration as is feasibly possible. Right? Whether it's one-to-one, group-based, you know, leadership level, SRM to supported role, to whatever. Just maximize it.
Yeah.
Then what you've been working on, and I think it has been like the roadblock or the bumps along the road, has been trying to come up with a solution that solves the limitations of that extensive amount of collaboration. But I don't know if you've necessarily defined out what all of the barriers to collaboration are first. So that's kind of what I was writing down as I was just, I mean, you were saying them. And,
I got a big one.
What is your big one?
Habitual behavior.
Yeah.
You know, and that's actually where, for me, again, in the last several months, that's what I've been thinking about that exclusively, right? Because if we're looking at a systems problem, and actually I had mentioned Amy, she runs communications, is, you know, for me, it kind of dawned on me, I'm like, all right, somewhere in this collaborative process, because if we look at, so again, let's get up to what we have right now is the creating accountability chart, which I know is changing because in my brain it has changed. But, you know, right now, you know, what you have is you get through reality, ownership, solutions, and plan. And from plan, you get to implementation. And implementation is the individual utilizes the resources to implement the plan. So, which you shouldn't have a word define itself. Doesn't matter. So when we look at implementation, it was a matter of like, okay, well, if implementation is successful, then you move to success. Cool. Well, why was it successful? Because I was more clear. because I was more consistent, because I had more confidence, I had more competence. But the question is, all right, so if you fall again, and fall is that, again, maybe the plan didn't work, the solution wasn't appropriate for the problem, we thought we had an idea going into it, but it wasn't exactly what we should have been doing or whatever. So you come back to fall tolerance, and the idea with fall tolerance is you circle back by being like, cool, we're going to jump back to collaboration, we're going to try to figure this out again. More often than not, what we have is not a unwillingness to uphold policy and process. It's not an unwillingness to do so. We have a desire, where most people, generally speaking, have a desire to do good work. You have a desire to do excellent work. You have a desire to be the best in your field. You have a desire for all of these things that you mentioned. You get this return on investment. You have a desire for that. But often what happens is that we have habitual behavior that does not support that desire. So when we look at habitual behavior, it's then a matter of, well, how do you fix habitual behavior to then have a success, to not just have a desire to do so, but actually move that desire into success? And the question is, do you try to fight habit, or do you create new habits? And we talked about this before. It is very much, again, my opinion, I know it's a common opinion, is that for me, I have no intention of fighting bad behavior. I have every intention of training new behavior.
Yeah.
And as we train new behavior, again, that's where we will see more successes.
Yeah.
But with habitual behavior being one of those barriers, the question is, who is monitoring, and how are we monitoring the training of new habitual behavior?
Right.
And that's where, for me, when we say the lack of follow-up, when we say lack of follow-up, again, habitual behavior is the lack of follow-up. The individual is not going back to their supporting role member, or is that the lack of follow-up, the supporting role member is not going back to the individual. And we need to have two halves of the pie. It's what we talk about with mentorship. You need to have, a mentor can't do more work than a mentee, and a mentee can't do more work than a mentor. So it's who's going to make the first move, who's going to make the first engagement, who's going to end up doing that. But I would say those are your probably two biggest barriers, because most of the time people show the desire. I want to do better. I want to do this. I want to learn that. Absolutely, that makes sense. I want to do that next time. I don't want to have this conflict next time. But if they are rooted in habitual behavior, then they're going to do it again. And then you go back through the collaboration process, reality, ownership, solutions, plan. And what happens when you have a reality established, they own the problem, they see the solution, we have a plan, but then they just didn't do it. They just didn't do it. Well, I have the desire to, but I just didn't do it. Well, why? Well, I don't know. I want to, I just didn't. And it's like, then maybe we don't have a tool of collaboration to make sure the mentors and the mentees are collaborating appropriately to make sure that new habitual behavior is taught. And again, it's not to say that there aren't multiple ways to do things. I mean, that's the important thing here, is that if, again, we have conflict with someone who's doing, well, this is the way that I do it. And it's like, well, maybe that is actually more efficient than the process we currently have. So it is malleable. We have to be willing to understand that there are times that administration needs to, bend, and there are times when individuals need to bend. But ultimately, that is, again, what I've been thinking really, really hard about, is what is the problem? And it dawned on me. The problem is not desire. Most people who want to have a return on investment, they have a desire to get that return.
Yeah. It can be desire. That's one of the things. So in the ideal team player is humble, hungry, and smart. What you're referring to is hunger. And thankfully, here we don't necessarily have a significant issue with hunger.
I think that's a fair point.
Like, it exists outside of here.
Yeah, I think that's what I mean, is internally. Yeah, we don't have a problem with desire. But you're right. In a different setting, that may end up being the identification of a problem within those teams. Maybe you have people who actually don't have the desire to change.
Yeah.
Why are we here?
Right.
Why are we here?
And that's a big reason why we push shared purpose so hard, is because if you get in line with that, hunger is very natural.
Yeah.
Like, to desire to serve the patient better, more effectively, more efficiently is typically something that people that decide that they want to work with animals all day long can get behind pretty darn fast.
Yeah.
It's not
an industry. Yeah.
It's an individual in the industry, statistically highly probable trait.
Yeah. Yes.
So
yes. Unless it's been beat out of them through unnecessary conflict.
Right.
Whether it be past employers to education process to debt to income, loss of self-worth.
To me, that plays into humble, right? So like if you have been exposed to non-humble behavior or process, that is something that can, a non-ideal team player can ruin an ideal team player. Like it's bad apple spoils the bunch kind of scenario. And because that's so, and we've had it here where we've had people who have been essentially, we know who they are, less humble, and it ruins the cultural environment in the moment, and then over time it erodes it outside of just the moment and just kind of starts to get down into the structures. And that's got to go because it's so contagious to have that like divisive mindset. And to me, that's, humility does play really heavily into collaboration, because to be collaborative, you have to acknowledge that you failed.
Yes.
Which is typically not something that people who aren't humble like to do. So that's another big thing. But to go with the third point, and I think that this is why having somebody who is specifically designated to the monitoring and fulfillment of collaboration on a more maximized level is smart. And it's not to say that the people who work here aren't smart.
Right.
But how many of us in the industry, especially if you take technicians or veterinary nurses and then doctors, are trained in what active collaboration should be?
No.
It's very sparse. Like, and even to get that in any profession is difficult, because I went to business school and all this crap where it's like that would make more sense to learn how to communicate since you took a whole bunch of communications classes. And not really. And I think what tends to happen is we just get thrown in, and some people figure it out and some people don't. But in this industry, the education is very trade based, because you have to learn so many skills to be good at your job that don't include communication, that don't include collaboration. And just by a lack of education, you're not as intelligent on collaboration as you can be. And no one here is saying that everyone that's listening to this cannot learn how to actively collaborate very, very well. But we have to walk into every engagement with an individual who hasn't been through an active collaborative process and assume that they know nothing. And that's really hard to do, because to be the person that is actively monitoring that process, like for me, as like a part of me is like, I could do that, but another part of me is like, I'd be terrible at it because I tend to run out ahead, right? And it's like, oh shit, that's right, you're back there, and that's not your fault. Like there's no blame here. The reality is you need to be caught up. The reality is you need a little bit of education to be a really productive member of this process. It's just that little bit of education goes a really, really long way, because you have the desire. And once I point you in the right direction and you run that way, you're going to catch up really, really fast. But that first step is pretty hard, and to notice it and see the signs of somebody struggling with, how do I actively collaborate with those that are around me in a way that is productive, in a way that doesn't significantly inhibit the efficiency of patient care, all that sort of stuff. That's really freaking hard to do.
Well, and I think a lot of it is timing. It's like, I think a lot of the, we've talked about this for actually way back in the beginning when we were still, running out triage in a less efficient manner than we do now. But it was a matter of like, a new staff member comes to a, more senior staff member and like, how do I do this?
Yep.
And they're like, just do this. And they're like, well, why? And it's like, I don't have time to answer that right now. Yep. That can, the education part can happen at a later time. And it's actually kind of funny because we had one of our newer staff actually go to Annie about one of our senior staff for that exact point. Mm-hmm. I don't have time, the senior staff, I don't have time to go over this with you right now. So he or she was actually being identified as someone who was unwilling to collaborate or, sort of unwilling to engage. And it was actually like, no, that's actually our directive, is that there's not necessarily a time for collaboration at every single moment. Mm-hmm. So it's we kind of, like I said, with the tier 1 stuff, it's like, all right, well, I just need to get the basics out there. We're going to elaborate on the if then later. Mm-hmm. So it's the perception of being blown off. Yeah. It's like, well, if I can't get an answer on this right now, then I'm going to get blown off. And it's like, that's not the point. Yep. Is that collaboration can happen at any times, but depending on what else is happening around us, we also need to be aware what's happening around us. But we also then need to make sure there is a process in place so that the person doesn't actually get blown off. Right. Is that if there was a teaching point or there was a growth point or there was a clarity point or whatever it is, we need to make sure that's also followed up on. Mm-hmm. And that's where, like you said, when you look at a group of people, whether it's our SRMs or another individual kind of overseeing collaboration, that's essentially the conversation, is make sure that as we start to have these plans, because what's a tier 1 and tier 2 employee? It's a spoon-fed plan. Mm-hmm. This is your plan. Mm-hmm. Go through the training over the next 3 months. This is your plan. Mm-hmm. But then when you kind of get outside of that, it's like, all right, well, what's my plan now? Well, we're going to talk to you twice a year. Cool. What's my plan between those twice a year talking points? Mm-hmm. It's like, yes. Yeah. So when you come into that process, right, where it's like, all right, what are we going to do? Ground floor to, like I said, 2 halves of the pie. You have to have mentorship. Yep. You have to have mentee stewardship. At least in some capacity, you have to be on both sides. But when you're spoon fed that plan in the first, tiers 1 and 2, that's pretty straightforward. Mm-hmm. Again, not to say that 3 months is as clear as it could be, because obviously there are some clarity items there. But again, we've had these things, we've had these tools, but how do we sort of bring it into that day-to-day utility? Yeah. And that's where, again, we sort of sided with the 515s. At least that's the current running thought. Again, Katie and I, we still have to kind of finish on the way to do it. But
because so in that, you talk about how those first 90 days, even a little bit beyond that, it is pretty darn spoon-fed. That to me is one of those things where once you get through that process, there has to be like this reset or breaking point to get into something else, because you talk about how habitual behavior is the problem or part of the problem. One of the biggest barriers to collaboration. Well, I've just spoon-fed you something for 90 days. Yeah. Every day. Yeah. Just something. Because I have to. Yes. I absolutely have to tell you how to do this job well with as much clarity as I can give you. Yeah. We're working on clarity. We're working to create consistency. We're increasing competence, benchmarking stuff, all that. But it creates a habit of, right? Like, just
feed me.
Feed me, right? Nothing wrong with that. Yeah. But how do you break that? How do you get out of that habit? Because now it's a question of, okay, I'm good at this job. Like, I have the fundamentals down. Yep. How do I get better? Why does me getting better matter? Yeah. Why does this process exist? Yeah. How can we make more clarity? How can we make more consistency across the board? And that's a way different process, because now I'm creating collaboration. Yeah. I'm not waiting for it. Yes. And that's, 4 to 5 in accountability.
Yeah, it's up there. And so we've had that conversation in different ways. Yeah. We've talked about the ABCD employee versus the A1, A2, A3, A4, B1, B2, B3, B4. Yeah. So if you have a spoon-fed process, you're saying, hey, here's your A1 through 10. Right. Here's your B1 through 15. Just go ahead and consume it, please. But we keep saying that, one of the ways in which we identify ideal team player is you really want to have ABCD employees. Yeah. People who can be like, all right, here's, I think Dane actually refers to it as the spirit of the law. Yep. It's like, this is generally how things are done. And, here's the confines in which we want you to work. Now go do it obviously, if there's new things developed along the way, we can train things new ways and so on and so forth. But again, we've talked about that, and Trevor actually kind of says the same thing. He's like, the more policies we make, the more procedures we make, he says we start to have more people lacking or losing independent thought, independent process. Well, the only way I can do this is if I ask for permission how to do it.
Right.
And you're exactly right. So then you couple that on the individual side, where now they're like, well, they are telling me this is the way that I need to do this, and this is the way that I need to do it. And like, I don't want to make a mistake and get yelled at. I don't want to make a mistake and do this wrong. And I don't want, and it starts to drive back that dialogue of the victim mentality. They're sort of powerless to take responsibility for those actions. Well, you need to tell me how to do it. And you're exactly right. So how is it that you, in one period of time, now when I say period of time, I'm going to include the entire education system. You can't go to the bathroom without a hall pass. You can't do this without asking permission. You need to do this and then take that test. So even through, elementary school, middle school, high school, and even into higher education, we're sort of forced into this idea of just following the rules. The alarm compliance. The bell goes off, next class, bell goes off, next class. So we're now saying, yeah, that's cool, but you're only going to do that for 3 months, and then you're going to learn this whole new thing, sort of. And so how do you do that? How do you transition that over into saying, well, we have on one hand, like I said, I'm going to spoon feed you this, but how do you get them to close their mouth and be, not waiting to be fed, but how are you going to leave the nest and, start to then, learn how to feed yourself and, do a lot of these things and a lot of these items. And it does, at least in some capacity, come back to your self-perceived assessment of, convictions. How, are you confident? Is this something where you trust yourself? Is it something, so when you then overlap this and being like, well, I'm not comfortable enough, I'm not confident enough to step out on my own to start making decisions on this, that's the transition. That's the transition from tier 2 to tier 3, but ultimately it's to tier 4. Because tier 4 is you are engaging in that collaboration enough that you're either going to advance the industry or you're going to advance things locally. So to just say you're going to go from a 90-day tier 2 employee to then just making the flip over to being like, and now I'm going to be all on my own and I need to learn how to do this by myself and these types of things. It kind of goes against the idea of collaboration. It's like, no. We have tools, and that's feedback. We have collaborative devices that get you closer and closer and closer to being more confident in your job. And with that confidence comes your ability to train others, to engage collaboration, to engage growth as a whole. And that's, again, even with a couple of our new technicians we onboarded, I think they've probably been about 6 months or so, is that they have that same thing. They're like, we thought we were really good techs before. They're like, but our skills have exploded since we've been here. So it's that kind of idea where it's like, all right, if we have an active feedback mechanism, and that's ultimately a solution, is that whether you're in a small group, small team, or a large organization, you have to have a process of follow-up and follow-through. So you need the individual to follow through. You need and you need a process by which we're going to follow up. So with that, the reason that you need that system though is because you have to have somebody that's like kind of pulling it out of the people. Because it goes from a spoon feed to, okay, now I'm going to ask you leading questions, and you're going to then ask me more questions. Like, you're going to collaborate with the person that knows how to do it best first. A part of that is definitely self-awareness in understanding how you communicate, how that person communicates, being aware of like how communication works on a more fundamental level. But then because the fact that we just don't have that experience, like for me, I know how I learned how to do it, and it was experience. I sucked at it, and then I tried more, and then I got better at it, and now I'm okay at it. Like, I'm not great at asking the why question or asking the how can we do better question in a very effective way at the right time. Right? Because I think that's what we're asking for, is like, I can't tell you why this matters to you. Right.
You have to ask me why something matters, and then you contextualize it around yourself.
Yes.
I also can't necessarily always, you have a perspective. I can't see your perspective, so I can't ask the question about how to do something better from your perspective.
Right.
Like, I've seen it from my perspective. I've tried to make it as good as I can.
Right.
But you're seeing it differently. So now the active collaborator, the person that is responsible for that role, is then asking that question to that person.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, how do we make this better? From your perspective, why does this matter to you?
Right.
How do we tie this all together? Because if you are able to engage that improvement process and engage the fact that this is personally like fulfilling, like, well, then the rest is easy.
Right.
Then I'm not afraid to ask why anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid, even if it's, that like that pause of I can't do this right now because there's 25 patients that are here. So that's the other part of that person's role. That collaborator is like, hey, how's your follow-up going?
Yeah.
Because you're really good at pausing the conversation.
Right.
How are you following up? When are you following up? What kind of time frames are you on? That sort of thing, which you're not going to bat 1,000 on that, by the way.
Yeah. Right.
Like, accept that failure now.
Yeah.
But that's a huge role to be the person that's like that in between, but also not in between.
Right.
Right. Like, I am the vehicle of just creating these conversations, but I'm not actually solving problems. I'm just creating the process that solves problems.
Yeah.
That's hard for a lot of people to do because I think a part of it gets taken for granted. When you're not the person that's coming up with the solutions, you can get dismissed.
Right.
Because it's like, well, clearly that's the process.
Yeah.
That's what was supposed to happen.
Yeah.
We're just making you make it happen, and you just get forgotten. But
well, and that's even when I was kind of talking to her about it, my initial thoughts on it was more like individual based, on saying, well, this person's kind of in charge of that. But you're right. It's, how is that information coming through and how is that information getting back? And even Caroline, she made the joke, she's like, I'm pretty much an emailer who emails, when we're talking about the education coordinator, it's just like, well, I don't know if I'm really helping. It's like, no, you are, just to facilitate, it's like greasing the wheels, and I think the concern that I would have is, what did you define that? The bullshit jobs.
Oh yeah.
And for those, you just define it again for those who may not have heard before.
It's a bullshit job is a job that was created because of the presence of another job. So and it's not to say that accountants are worthless. Yeah. Accountants do a lot of very good things, but if it weren't for the IRS, there would be many fewer accountants.
Yes.
So if you are not able to understand the purpose behind what it is that you're doing and how it's productive and a positive if you're not contributing to the growth of the entity that you're serving, rather you're just staving off something else, it's essentially a bullshit job.
Yeah, and that's where, so for me, whenever the idea of like a middle job or middle management comes up into it, or middle support role, or whatever it is, I always think to myself, I'm like, is this a bullshit job? Like, if we take away this other thing, does that job even need to exist?
Right.
And I think that's what, again, one of the thoughts when I kind of brought it to Katie, about a week and a half ago now, it was kind of that idea. It's just like, I think this is the way to do this.
Yeah.
But like you said, it needs to happen in a way that it's not just a bullshit job, because again, we have to have scalability in both directions. If we are advising people to say, hey, we need a collaborator, to say, all right, do we need a collaborator in a group of 10 and an accountability agent in a group of 10? Mm-hmm. Do we need that in a group of 100, either, as accountability or growth? And I believe the answer is yes. So, in the day, when we were a smaller group, we would have had a collaborator as an add-on role.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, you're going to help us kind of facilitate this. It's just you're going to need 5 hours a week in addition to your current duties and yada, yada, yada.
Yep.
But now it's a matter of being like, no, it does kind of serve the greater good. I mean, there's only so much time in the day, and to have someone be able to assemble and track and, and whether it's a single individual or a group that's kind of doing it, again, not to say that that's completely been identified. But again, when we talk about creating accountability, you can't actually create accountability without collaboration.
Right.
So if you're having somebody monitor accountability, somebody needs to be monitoring collaboration, and or a group of individuals need to be monitoring collaboration.
Right.
In a very responsible way. So like you said, you have to make sure that the flow of information happens in both directions, only because what ends up happening, and again, my fear of corporatized medicine or corporate environments is basically when you have solutions on the ground level that are then being chucked off or ignored, or when it's a small problem. So if we're ignoring small problems, what happens when a small problem becomes a very big problem? We're like, I wish we would have dealt with this 6 months ago.
Right.
So, again, there is benefit to at least acknowledging that small problems exist, and that's the whole thing behind traction. Between 1 year to 3 months to a week, so on and so forth. That's the whole idea of having those issues lists. But you have to have a really, really active process to not ignore the issues, but prioritize the initiatives and your prioritize the issues.
Yeah, that's kind of twofold. So what we would call that in organizations where they would just have like a list of like 150 issues, they got substantial in previous other engagements. It was, okay, list them all out. Like that would be like 2 hours worth of meeting, just get it all out there. Because if we don't know what the problems are, we can't solve the problems. However, of us 150, 130 are going to go into this thing we call a parking lot. Like, we know that they exist. We are not discounting the fact that they exist. However, in terms of priority, our fire is hottest in these 20 things. And if we can solve these things, solving these other issues gets much easier. Because we're not having to just like keep pulling people out of the burning building here. We're going to put the fire out. So that was a big thing. But the one is the collection of that data. That's hard to do. That's hard to encourage people to say bad things about the people that pay them. Right. Also,
to the people who pay them.
Right. So I work on the ground floor. How do I essentially talk shit about my employer to my employer? That's hard. That's a big hurdle for a lot of people. The second thing is, then once you get through that triaging and prioritization process of those issues, how do you communicate that in an effective way to everybody that just fed you the other 130? Because that's that don't blow off my issue. Because if you blow it off, I'm never going to say another damn thing again. That's the fear of the employee survey, or the flaw, excuse me. If you don't have good follow-up, even if you never, ever solve that problem. Like, if you don't follow up, or if you follow up on a problem that you never solve, at the very least, you're acknowledging to that person that you heard them. That is a problem, right? And if they're continuously heard, they will continue to give feedback. Not necessarily focused on the implementation of a solution, but they're focused on the collaboration. And that's like, I give, you take. That's essentially collaborate, and then we both move forward together. And I think
there's even a healthy respect of what the issues are. Is that in kind of going through what the issues are, it's a matter of like, is someone actually going to step up? So if someone actually sees that we have these 130 issues and we're 150. We're working on these 20. There's another 130 pending, and then you have 10 people be like, "Hey, can we maybe work on 50 of those?" Awesome. Well, let us, direct traffic. Let us direct the solution creating, or at least the plan and implementation of fixing those 50, at least in some capacity. Give us a heads up as you try to start to have those solutions. But I would say that would be another barrier to system correction, is who if anybody is willing to step up and step forward to aid in this process. Right. And are they necessarily responsible to step up? But again, I think that there becomes a healthy acknowledgement of when, like you said, not just that the issues are heard, but it's a collective parking lot of being like, look at how many cars we have out there.
Right.
You know, does anyone want to move some of those cars around for us and get them back on the road?
Yeah.
You know, and if the answer is, well, no, I can't help. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. It's like, all right, cool. Then at least be respectful of the fact that the group who is collaborating to work on solutions for the system-wide issues, just as much as the individual-based problems, give them a little slack to know that we can't fix all 50 right now.
Right.
You know,
right.
and that's where, again, like you said, it's a matter of saying, nope, we definitely have your problem on the list of 150. These are the ones that, you know, not to say they're more or less important, but these are the ones that really need to be solved right now. Mm-hmm. And again, as we work through it, like you said, maybe solutions here will create, you know, or at least our plan here will create solutions in other areas.
It just creates opportunity for other solutions once those problems are gone. Because if you're continuously tending to the same 10 problems, you can't solve the other ones that exist.
Correct.
I think a big part of that too, though, with like, because what you're saying in, like, there's nothing wrong with not necessarily wanting to solve, like, be the person that creates the solution, that implements the plan, right? Like, that's okay, but that's level 3 performance, as we kind of like struggled to define a couple of years ago. Where it's like, okay, then just acknowledge what the standards are and uphold the standards. Like, I'm not expecting you to come up with the solutions to engage us at a higher level. That's fine.
Yeah.
Continue to do your job well, and we are more than happy to have you here every day. Yeah. Like, whatever day is your schedule, that's perfect.
Yeah.
So there is that, but I think a part of the fear of jumping into 4 and jumping into 5 of that, like, now I'm improving, now I'm trying to increase competence and increase clarity with these people that I work around, is where do I go first? Right, and that's kind of when you say directing traffic. Yeah. Number one, if I don't know the full reality or the full scope, right? If I don't ever see the 150 issues, how do I know what to solve? Yeah. But also, if I see it, well, that's a lot of stuff. I think I could do that one.
Right.
Like, now who do I ask? Like, who do I go to collab, or even just be like, hey, I have a potential solution. Yeah. And not having that type of a, you know, and I think we kind of have that with the SRMs and having our org chart in essentially being a communication chain and that sort of stuff. But that, or even like opening the door. So if I have somebody that's specifically like, hey, the door's open, what do you got to say? Yeah. Having that active collaborator type role does increase the likelihood of that thought process of, hey, I want to solve this problem. It doesn't guarantee it.
Right.
But yeah, that's a tough hurdle for a lot of people to get over. The other part of it too that I will just throw out there is setting realistic expectations from an ownership level of those that you work with.
Oh,
right?
sure.
So like, that's a Gary Vee thing where it's like, you're never going to have people that are going to work as hard as you if you're a business owner, and you should never expect them to.
No,
So like, what are your expectations for these people solving these issues?
And I think if you are in an administrative position, supporting position, ownership position, I think the answer to that is how much failure do you have consistently among multiple people? Yeah. So if you say, this is how I define a veterinary nurse or technician, this is how I define a doctor, this is the role responsibility of caregiver support guide, this is whatever, and it's like, this is what I have decided this job can do. And then you have 10 people in that job, 4 people in that job, 3 people in that job, and it's like they're not upholding the standard that you set out. There's 2 ways to go about it. One is go into a performance review, as an administrator. I said that this job was doable. And when you signed your contract, when you took employment, you said this job was doable. You said you could perform this task. You said you could do this. And then you have that same conversation with like 5 people.
Right.
And it's like, okay, so does that mean that the role description needs to change because now we have systemic flaw, or do we just have 5 people who all individually have the same problem?
Right.
And are they different or are they the same?
Right.
And again, so I think that's the answer, is that you're right. You have to set realistic expectations for individuals, team members, but it needs to be an active process. That's the thing, and I think we need to make sure that if we take away responsibilities, we're not taking away responsibilities because of a lack of desire. Because again, if we have desire, if they are hungry, that's different. But if it's like, I just don't want to do this, we're not saying take away responsibilities because someone doesn't want to do something. But it's like, it's for us with the caregiver support, I mean, it's the same thing with the office generalist. That's now 2 different jobs. Caregiver support, we're talking about having, 2, 3, and 4 on at a time. This one's running this one's doing that, this one's doing this. And it's like, because we continue to see repeated conflict, people were offboarding before the end of their 3 months. Like, it is absolute chaos. Yeah, it's fucking chaos. So that's then the thought, be like, all right, well, if this is the conflict, how do we start to change these roles? How do we start to redefine these roles? How do we start to create a realistic expectation for employees? And that would have never happened without collaboration.
Right.
It would have just been like, why is everyone failing at this job that we wrote down that we think they should be able to do when we had a quarter of the business that we had 5 years ago?
Right.
Right. So
again, it comes back to what we said, a few minutes ago, or, maybe 20 minutes ago, is like, we can't use the pandemic as a crutch to just explain away our problems and not come up with objective solutions to those problems. Like it sucks. I mean, there's a lot of really bad things happening in the world, as there will always continue to be bad things that happen in the world. So it's just right now, this is sort of the bad thing that's happening to us collectively. So it's a matter of like, okay, coming back into the growth mindset, not just this, not being powerless to it, not being victim to it, but what is that opportunity to improve performance and improve fulfillment? All right, well, let's start to collaborate on where have the stressors come from. We had this issues list. We said, this is what we're going to deal with in the next year. We got halfway through the year and it's like, oh my God, we haven't even touched our initiatives yet. Cool, change what your initiatives are.
Yep.
You thought that was the way we were going, but we need to go in that direction. And in going in that direction, how are we going to continue to have a feedback mechanism from those around us, whether it be supporting role members, so on and so forth? How do we have this feedback mechanism to make sure that we actually are focusing on the hottest fire?
Yeah.
Is this the iron that we should be striking right now, or is there another one in the fire that's substantially hotter that needs to be struck? And that's part of that collaborative process, which you need administratively. You need that administrative. That's why, again, the collaborator position isn't a bullshit job.
Yep.
You need someone directing traffic on what the initiative is. And even today I was having that conversation that it was like, really falling into ownership and falling into management was more of like, I just need to see some change around here. And I need to, again, that return on investment, I need to be fulfilled. And then it was just like, oh my God, we're becoming more efficient. Now we're seeing more business. Now we're seeing more of this. Now our team has grown. That's not an accident. It's not, we're not completely victim to the amount of business that we had coming in. It's like, no, we have this much business because we can handle this much business with the number of people that we have, which is a substantial amount for a relatively small crew. And that didn't happen by accident, and it's saying that when we started out with PAW and saying we have this, it's, we talked about before, it's the quality and quantity cross, where quality and quantity cross, plan for that. How do we get to that point? Well, you need a collaborator. And sometimes, that's kind of our relationship with starting our strategic planning. We needed that collaborative mechanism. But then it's like, how do you then boil that over into the staff level? And it's there.
I think the process will probably be pretty similar.
Absolutely.
Because what I was actually just going to say that, like, you didn't know how to do it, right? Like, it wasn't it's not an innate skill set.
No, I had to leave the room, remember?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's not even so, it's not even so much that you were just like, we have to do everything now. Like, that was, it was satirical, but it was also serious. And it's like, I get it. Like, but also you're the three people at the time that are implementing these solutions, because the thing is, if you try and delegate this stuff, it is going to go very poorly. Like, you have to be the people that set these standards out, because it was very company early, and it was just like, holy shit, like, we just got to cross some boxes off here, right? And through that, you went from I'm going to do everything to how do I delegate as much as possible?
Yep.
And that was a big learning curve. And I think a lot of people, once they get into that, like, I want performance level 4, I want number 5, I want to be a leader, I want to be a mentor, is that that initial response is going to actually be a rescuer response.
Yes.
Right.
No,
it's completely.
It is funny you say that.
Yeah.
Because that actually I have been thinking about this last week because I'm working at the doctor's schedule coming into the fall or what have you, and I've been thinking about that very exact thing.
Yeah.
I have been falling back on old habit of, well, we have open shifts, we have PTO that needs to get covered, we have a lot of these different items, and I'm just like, well, I'll do it. 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 And it's like, wait a minute, Riolo, this is exactly what you have been doing or had been trying to do 5 to 6 years ago, and you can't.
Right.
And part of that is, in my mind, and it's something that I still struggle with, is it's an admission of failure. I can't do all of this on my own. Shifts to work. I can't do all of this on my own. Work to be had, surgeries to be done. I can't do all of this on my own. It's just, to me, it feels like a failure. But really what it is it's my innate process of being a rescuer. It's here to save the day. I can come in, I can do this. I believe that that others value the good deeds, which I know there is value from others in what I do, but to say that is, this thing that I fall back to, it's like, no, it needs to be a more collaborative effort on, here is realistically what I need help with.
Right.
And this is the plan that I have currently for what I need help with, rather than just, turtling all of this stuff in and just keeping it in my shell and saying, nope, I'll just deal with it. It's like, but that's not how it works. That didn't happen administratively. We grew so much faster by just being open and having an open line of communication. It should be the same thing with shift work. It should be the same thing with working as a technician, working as a veterinarian, being like, I just need help. And you don't know other people's perspective. You don't know what they have on their day-to-day. You don't know what they're willing to do. But until you ask for help, you make assumptions that they don't want to do it. You have assumptions that they don't want to do it. You have assumptions that they don't have time to do it.
Right.
And those are all assumptions. It's not appropriate.
Yeah.
So that's where, again, it's like, for me, when, because I get a lot of questions. I'm a solo practitioner. I'm trying to find another veterinarian. I'm trying to do this. I don't have time to do it. I get those questions a lot. Carlo, how do you do it all? How can you get this done? How can you do that? And it's like, honestly, it's because of the team around me. It always has been because of the team around me. It's family life and kids. How do you do that? It's because I have an amazing wife who can do all of these things that I can't when I'm doing these other things. It's the only way that it works. And again, I think that as veterinarians as a whole, we struggle with the idea of allowing other people to do things that we want to have control over. It's not a failure to give up responsibility of an item. It's an active engagement of collaboration. So the more things we can acknowledge that we can't get done, and the more things we can acknowledge to have someone to collaborate with and someone to perform that task, the more we are engaging growth. Growth are individuals that are committed to the success of the individual and the team. And every time we fall back on just, say, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, just stop.
Yeah.
Just don't. Engage those around you. And don't be a rescuer to the task.
Right. So last night, I will say I have not read this book, but it came up, actually, I was listening to a Joe Rogan podcast, and he brought up this book. It's called The 4 Agreements, A Practical Guide to Personal Freedom. It was written by Don Miguel Ruiz. I have not read this book, but basically it's similar to some Jocko Willing stuff where it's like, it's similar to extreme
Yank
ownership.
the Band-Aid. Yep.
It's he's got his discipline equals freedom. He's got the his code. I don't remember the name of it, but he's like a personal code book. But it's 4 agreements. It's 1, be impeccable with your word. So I want to bring that one up because it is, if you're going to play that rescuer role, I'm sorry to tell you, at some point, you're going to promise that you're going to do something and you're not going to do it.
Yes.
You're going to overpromise and underdeliver.
Yes.
You and I have both lived that in
Yes.
our own lives.
Go ahead and talk to Katie about that on my behalf.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So the thing about that, and the reason that this matters is, like, yes, there's value in it, and like you can see and realize that value, but at some point that habitual behavior is going to bite you right in the ass.
Absolutely.
Number two,
Speaking from experience.
right,
Yes.
right,
Yes.
and continuing to learn from it too, like, because
Trying.
right. Number two, don't take anything personally.
Yeah.
I think that's
fine.
like you and I don't necessarily have that as a barrier, but to me, like these are actually pretty good rules for collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not here when I'm collaborating with you to tell you that you're a bad person.
Correct.
This is not me versus you.
Right.
We have to have that actively in our mindset because of the cultural training of division.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
With the presence of the political environment and like everyone's day to day and how it's so me versus you, and then also just the drama dynamic that exists in every TV show in the whole freaking world right now.
Yep.
We're all being trained discreetly to take things personally, and we have to say, no, I'm not going to take this personally. We're going to disagree on the what, the how, the when, the where, but we're not going to disagree on the why. And I'm going to look at you, and we might disagree, but you're still, at the very least, my coworker, and I'm going to respect you.
Yeah.
Number three, you just said it, don't make assumptions.
Yep.
Walk into every scenario curious.
Yep.
Actually, I'm going to put a link in the description to it's like a 5-minute clip from the show Ted Lasso. Have you watched? Have you heard of the show? No. So Ted Lasso is about a American football coach that gets hired to coach English football, and he's just full of monologues. And it's Jason Sudeikis, so it's funny too.
Yeah.
But he talks about how every time that you assume or judge somebody, you're just not curious enough.
Yeah.
You haven't asked. Yeah. You haven't asked the right question yet. And it's not to say that your assumption might be wrong, but don't assume that you're right.
Yep.
And then the last one is always do your best. So if you're going to get into it, give it all you got.
Yep.
And I think if you go into the concept of collaboration with those 4 rules, I don't know if there's much a way, I wrote down all these barriers, but it's like those kind of go away if you're doing all of those things. And then you have a person who teaches people how to do all of these things. So you talk about rescue response, but it's like, well, it's not because I am worried about you creating more victims. It's because I want you to be impeccable with your word. Yeah. And this sequence of behaviors will get you out of that. Yeah. And that's going to be a problem.
Yeah. Yep. And that was actually my dad's father. That was one of the big things that he got into me probably in my teenage years, actually. He's like, don't say something if you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
That was like his big selling point. I mean, obviously it's not like he had those 4 things stated.
Yeah, but
it still drives home that like some of these things really aren't necessarily new.
Right.
Some of them aren't necessarily unique or they aren't, groundbreaking. But the idea is, like you said, in that collaborative process, I agree. If you can hit those 4 and trying to be objective as possible. And that's why I like the after action. That's why I haven't shed a tear when we've had employees offboard themselves after actions. Mm-hmm. It's just like, oh, so we can't even talk about this objectively enough to identify if the problem is in the individual or if the problem is in the process.
Right.
We can't even get to that point. Oh, okay, cool. Then we're done here.
Right.
But yeah, so I mean, that's where again, I focusing very hard on that objective. But I mean, we're all, how can I say, we're all at risk for falling back into habitual behavior. Mm-hmm. But really the solution to habitual behavior is that active collaborative process and creating new habits. It's not even fighting the good fight of old habits. Just figure out a new way to create new habits. And with those new habits, eventually comes success. Mm-hmm. And as you start to create those new habits, if we can continue to hit barriers and identify what the new barriers are to the old habits, we may accidentally fix a portion of ourselves.
We may accidentally fix something within ourselves that allows us to teach other people. And that's where when we talk about, this collaborative process, there very well may be people who are like, cool, I'm happy that we identified those 150 problems. I need to deal with my own problems before I can deal with those 150 problems, but I don't even know what my own problems are. And that's where it's a matter of just this active, ongoing collaborative process to make sure that we are accountable. And you can't be accountable without collaboration.
I mean, that was the whole thing.
That was the whole thing.
You just nailed it.
Nailed it.
I was going to ask you to wrap it up, and you just did.
Yeah.
you hit it.
Well, there we go. Yeah, that was a pretty good, as we usually do, off the cuff podcast.
Sometimes you just got to see where the sentence goes.
It's got to go. So awesome. All right. Well, let's see ourselves out.
Yeah, you got it, man.
So, all right, guys. Thanks for coming around for another podcast. We'll catch you next time.